I'm Sergio Garcia, security researcher at Beyond Trust. Before that, I was one of the founding engineers at Prowler. I'm based in Miami, but I'm originally from Spain. And I try to break things in AWS so you don't have to. You can find me in Twitter, GitHub, or LinkedIn with my alias, Mr. Klausek. So this is the blog post that started it all. On July from last year, AWS announced a new type of long-lived credentials called Amazon Bedrock API keys, just to accelerate AI development and to have an easier authentication for Bedrock. But this was my reaction. Why? Because since AWS launched 2 decades ago, they were recommending and telling everyone to use short-term keys instead of long-term keys. And now they go and they ship a brand new type of long-lived credentials to interact with AI. And here's the agenda. We are going to cover how Bedrock API keys work. We are going to decode the keys. We are going to cover some attack vectors, how to detect the usage of these keys and potential attacks, and how to not get wrecked. So what are Bedrock API keys? As I told you before, they were launched on July from last year as an alternative to AWS credentials to interact with Amazon Bedrock. There are 3 ways to use them: as environment variables through the AWS CLI or the AWS SDK, and you can also use it as a bearer token in the authentication header if you want to directly talk with Bedrock using HTTP requests. And they come into flavors as short-term keys and long-term keys, which are the riskier ones. And here's the fun part. After just 2 weeks of being launched, they were appearing in public GitHub repos. So let's go ahead and generate these keys. As you may know, now in Amazon Bedrock, if you use the service, you can find a new API keys section. And if we generate first the short-term keys, you will get something like this. They are going to be always starting with Bedrock API key, followed by a base64 encoded SIG-before pre-signed URL. As you may know, SIG-before is the cryptographic protocol used by AWS to authenticate every single request. We will decode it later on. So for short-term keys, no identity is created. They use your 16 session and your permissions, but they are only usable in Bedrock. They expire with the session up to 12 hours, and this is the critical part. The creation happens on the browser in the client side, so that means that there is no CloudTrail event for these short-term API keys, only when they are used that we will see later. This is a sample of the client-side request where you can see how AWS is generating using your session these short-term keys. And now let's go ahead and generate the long-term API keys, which are way more interesting. If we go ahead and click that generate button, we can see that AWS is telling us that it's going to create something in IAM and attach that managed policy called Amazon Bedrock Limited Access. Keep that in mind, limited. There you can find also the API key name and notice the expiration options. You can go from 1 day to never expires. Yeah, never expires is an option. And I chose never expires for security, for research purposes. So I went ahead and clicked generate, and there we go. We just created an API key of an expiration date of 100 years. Cool. You can see that the API key name is there, and this is a little bit different from the short-term key because we are having a whole base64 encoded string that we will decode later on. But here is the kicker. If we see here, AWS just silently created an IAM user without even asking, and that was my reaction. I wasn't expecting that, so let's go ahead and click that link to see how that user looks like. This is what I called, by the way, a phantom user. So the username is going to be the prefix of the API key, and As you can see, now we have a new section for the IAM users called API keys for Amazon Bedrock, where we can have up to 2 long-term Bedrock API keys. And if we go to the permission tab, we can see the policy that AWS was telling us about before. Limited, again, keep that in mind. But first, let's go to CloudTrail, and we can see that CloudTrail tells us the story. Here we have the fingerprint of all the 3 events that Bedrock did by their own when we click on the generate button of the long-term API keys. We can see that IAM created a user, they attached the user policy of Amazon Bedrock Limited Access, and they created the service-specific credential, which was the long-term API key. If we zoom into the create service-specific credential event, we can see all the information relevant to that new long-term API key. The expiration date, the credential alias, and the ID of that new long-term API key, as well as the phantom user where that new API key is going to be there. So to recap a little bit of what we just saw, long-term keys, they can be generated in the console, in the CLI, in the SDK, and it's a base64 encoded string. AWS silently creates an IAM user under the hood with that pattern, and in CloudTrail we have the fingerprint, which are those 3 events. And the expiration, they can go from 1 day to never. If you see the diagram, you can see that what happened is that Bedrock handled that request. It created a user with the policy and the long-term API key in that new user. But don't worry, AWS attaches a limited policy by default to the IAM user. Sounds safe, right? Let's check what it's actually inside. We can see here the JSON of the Bedrock Limited Access policy, and we can see get a star, list a star, call with bearer token, which, for your information, the call with bearer token is the only single action that the API keys use to interact with AWS. So that is kind of expected. But delete guardrails, delete custom models by default. So basically, we are having admin permissions by default for that new API keys. But wait, there is more. If we scroll down the policy, we find these describe keys for all the keys in your account. List all the roles in your accounts, describe all the VPCs, all the subnets, all the security groups. So basically, this limited access policy contains a reconnaissance toolkit behind that. So my question for you is, do you think this is a Bedrock limited access? I don't think so. And here's the problem. So as I told you before, the API keys can only be used within the Bedrock service. So AWS scoped the keys. With those API keys, we could do all these actions in Bedrock, which are admin actions. But what happens if someone creates IAM access keys for that user? That person could actually use all these reconnaissance permissions, and AWS didn't scope the user for that specific use case. So again, AWS created an IAM user preposition for exploitation every time that you create a long-term API key. So let's go ahead now and decode these API keys. Starting with short-term keys, as I told you before, they have this pattern and a base64 encoded SIG-before pre-signed URL. If we decode this pre-signed URL encoded in base64, we'll find some relevant information like the expiration, the access key ID, the region, because Bedrock API keys are regional. And also, if we decode the token, which is encoded in base64, we could get the account ID of that short-term key. And with long-term keys, it's way easier. Why? Because if we decode the base64 encoded string, we would get this same pattern, which is the API key name, which contains the phantom username. So with both types of API keys, the attacker could get the account ID whose infrastructure is attacking. Let's go ahead and show you a demo of everything that I talked to you about to prove that this is real. So here I have a new terminal with no credentials. I'm trying to do a list foundation models in my Bedrock environment. It didn't work. Then I'm exporting a long-term Bedrock API key as an environment variable, and it did work. There we go. And then what I'm going to do is decoding this long-term API key, and we can see here that we have the phantom username that contains this API key and the account ID. Then what we are going to do, since we have basically admin permissions in Bedrock with these new API keys, I'm going to create a guardrail. Here I'm going to verify now if that guardrail was created by getting the ID. There you go, we have it there. And since I have delete by default for everything, I'm trying to delete here the guardrail, and it was successfully deleted. So there you go, that we have almost admin permissions in Bedrock. And here what I did is creating access keys for this phantom user to prove that I was actually able to list all the roles and using the rest of the reconnaissance permissions by using those access keys. All right, so now let's see the potential attack scenarios that can happen from these new Bedrock API keys. I'm going to explain an attack chain that it's the most common with the long-term API keys. So the step one, as we saw, the developer creates an API key. Then AWS silently creates a phantom IAM user with that limited access policy and the Bedrock API key. And then we have two attack paths. The most common one is that API key is leaked in a public GitHub repo. So the attacker can use that key to hijack your Bedrock environment by deleting guardrails, by deleting custom models, or doing LLM jacking attacks, which are quite common nowadays, and I will show you later a more extended diagram about LLM jacking attacks. And then we have another second path, which is if there is a compromised user in your account, an attacker can use that user to create IAM access keys in that phantom IAM user, and without creating any new identities, the attacker would be able to do reconnaissance in your account. And here's another problem. The phantom users always stay there. So here you can see a list of all the users that we have in our lab account every time that we were generating long-term API keys in Bedrock by testing it. And just to mention, none of these users have active Bedrock API keys. So until you manually delete the users, the phantom users are going to still be there. So the risk isn't just the key, it's a permanent attack surface that we are going to have with these phantom IAM users. So the biggest real-world impact is the LLM jacking attack, because this is happening a lot nowadays. This is basically when an attacker uses the victim's Bedrock account to direct all the prompt and responses and making the victim pay for the bill of Amazon Bedrock. In this case, in Bedrock, if the attacker maximizes all the quotas in Bedrock, they can bill the victim up to $14K per day and per region. So that makes the attacker earns like around 1 million per year of profit. And now let's see how to detect this. You can see here the CloudTrail event that happened when I did the list foundation models using the Bedrock API key before in the demo. And this is the field that matters the most. Why? Every time that in your AWS account someone uses a Bedrock API key, either a long-term or short-term API key, this call with bearer token field is going to be true. So I would suggest that if you are not alerting on this field, to start as soon as possible. And this is a summary of what we are monitoring now in CloudTrail. First of all, every time that a long-term API key is created, that means monitoring the create service specific credential action, plus an expiration date, because we are also monitoring if that new long-term API key was created with an expiration date of more than 90 days. Also, if a phantom user was created by monitoring the create user action, and if the username starts with that prefix. Any key usage, as I showed you before in the previous slide, every time that field is equals true, we are monitoring it to make sure that we are detecting every key usage. And the most critical one, potential privilege escalation in the phantom users by monitoring the create access key action in the phantom users. Now, in order to prevent and defend this, SCPs are your best friend. So if you're not using Bedrock API keys yet, or your company didn't approve the Bedrock API keys yet, I suggest to deploy this SCP to block every single key creation and usage of the Bedrock API keys. And recently, in September of 2025, AWS releases new conditions for IAM related to Bedrock because security researchers like me raised concerns. The first one is the bearer token type, where you can scope in the IAM policies the type of the Bedrock API key. In this case, I'm using it to deny and block every type of long-term API key usage. Then you have here another new condition that AWS released in September, which is the service-specific credential age days, where you can scope to block API keys depending on their expiration date. So for example, in here, we are blocking every single creation of long-term API keys if their expiration date is more than 90 days. And the second one is the most critical one because we are blocking every single create access key action in the phantom users. For incident response, the fastest way to handle a long-term key that was compromised is to attaching that policy to the phantom user that contains the leaked long-term API key, which basically denies every API key in Bedrock, every Bedrock API key usage. But if you want, you can also, as IAM access keys, to change the status of the API of the long-term API keys to inactive, or just delete that leaked long-term API key. For certain API keys, it's a little bit trickier because they can't be deleted. As I told you before, they are generated client-side, so that means that it is along with the session. So the fastest way to handle a leaked short-term API key is by attaching the same policy, but this time to the identity that generated the short-term API key. And this is another option that I also like it a lot, that is using the token issue time condition to revoke any past sessions, including the session that is along with that short-term API key. But please don't wait 12 hours for the short-term API key to expire. And good news, I open sourced everything. Here you can find the QR for the repo. With one single command in this repo, you are going to be able to scan and to find every single phantom user in your account. That means that if you have phantom users that are orphaned, which means that they don't have active Bedrock API keys, you can find them, and as well, you can automatically clean them up with this toolkit. With this toolkit, you can also decode the keys, both type of keys, the short-term and long-term keys, and you can do incident response. This toolkit allows you to do the emergency key revocation, which basically attaches those deny policies that I showed you before. It can get the CloudTrail timeline for you from the leaked Bedrock API keys and do forensic reports for that phantom users. And also in that repo, I included the 4 ready to deploy SCPs that I just showed you. So to finalize, some takeaways here. AWS creates Phantom IAM users silently without even asking for it. They are buried in CloudTrail unless you monitor those type of Phantom users. Limited is marketing, so keep that in mind that every time that someone in your organization creates and uses a Bedrock API key, they are going to have admin Bedrock permissions or reconnaissance permissions by default, and the keys were leaked in 2 weeks. So make sure that you are safely creating those keys and store them safely, because there are attackers that are making the victim pay up to $14K per day and earning around $1 million per year of revenue. And the Phantom users are always at risk. If you don't clean them up and manually delete them, they are going to be there always with potential credential leakage, insider threats, and privilege escalation. These are some additional resources that I used for both the research and the presentation. And that was all. Thank you very much for attending. And here you have the QR. Thank you. Any questions, any thoughts? That's a great question. So these API keys can only be used in Bedrock because they are not seek before credential, let's say. But for example, if you, with those API keys, if you create an agent, you could actually associate a role to that agent. So I haven't tried that, but that could be a good point. Thank you. So you mean if there are users that they don't appear in CloudTrail?
Yeah, do the Phantom users' activities show up in CloudTrail?
Yeah.
Okay.
So AWS silently creates those IAM users, but the create IAM user event, it's actually recorded in CloudTrail. But Bedrock does it without even asking for it. And this only happens, this creation, when you generate the long-term API key in the console. Expected behavior.